Hello, I'm Dr. Duke with The New American. I'd like to talk to you about probably the single greatest growing threat to the First Amendment. We've seen free speech and the First Amendment under assault all across the country. We've heard it from race baiters that you shouldn't be allowed to say or use words that offend people on the basis of race. We've seen it applied to all sorts of aspects of our culture, the attack on the First Amendment. But I think the single most dangerous entity out there now that threatens our First Amendment rights is the burgeoning transgender movement. I have never seen a lobbyist group. I have never seen a special interest group. I have never seen a fringe movement have so much power as expressed across the free world, that includes all the Western nations and the United States, to actually force people to change their speech. 5 years ago, no one was talking about this. 5 years ago, it would have been utterly inconceivable that we had a very tiny percentage of transgender people who are dictating to the rest of us who you will share a locker room with, who you will be allowed to shower with, what you can and can't say, a complete redrafting of our pronouns. Just 5 years ago, this would have been inconceivable. And as this movement grows, not necessarily in numbers, but in progressive clout, they're coming after your free speech rights. I was being interviewed by a student journalist at the university I teach just the other day, and we were talking about speech and what's acceptable and what's not. And at one point, he was very surprised because I said, let me ask you a theoretical question. I asked this young 20-year-old journalist, what would be the big deal if I said as a professor in a classroom that girls and girls are boys, that girls and girls and boys are boys? He looked at me, and I haven't said that, but I said, so what? So what if I had said that? It's a perfectly rational position. It's a position that is defended by science and by scientific biology. It used for thousands and thousands of years. It's been utterly, utterly unremarkable. But when I asked this student, I said, well, so what? I said, so what if I said in a university classroom, boys and boys and girls are girls? He looked me in the eye and he said, that would be hate speech. And it took me back. I said, what are you talking about? How could that possibly be hate speech, underwritten as it is by science and by biology and by what we factually know to be true, not just about our bodies, but our bodies down through history. What staggered me is how adamant this young man was that it's hate speech. And when I kept asking him why it's hate speech, he couldn't answer me. And the fact that he could not give me an argument why it was hate speech. Look, I could get it if he had said to me, well, I disagree with you, Dr. Pest. I think it is offensive. It's offensive to people who believe certain things. Well, that would have been at least an argument. But he could not even muster that. And yet, the more I kept challenging him to give me a reason why, a simple statement like boys are boys and girls, why a simple statement like that was hate speech, he could not do it. And rather than rethink his position or question his own assumptions, the more I asked him, the more adamant he became that it was hate speech. And it just got me to thinking of how utterly Orwellian this is, that this belief, promulgated again by a very small group of people, a belief that is predicated on absolute subjectivity. Right? It's what I think I am when I think I am that thing. It is it's the actual destruction of objectivity when it comes to something as basic as gender and sex. And so it got me thinking about this and looking at the news. Jessica Yaniv, for you who don't know her, she's a very loudmouthed man who identifies as a woman. She dresses like a woman. She parades around as a woman. About 6 months ago, she became an international problem because she started going to spas in Canada, and she demanded to be bikini waxed. Now, most of these spas were run by Asian Canadian females. And so she would walk into these spas, and she would demand of the Asian Canadian women that she get a bikini wax. And when the women found out that she actually had male body parts, not female body parts, they told Jessica Yaniv that we cannot do this. It's a different procedure. The way you wax a female and the way you wax a male, objectively speaking, are totally different. And they said, we are not qualified to do that. We provide bikini waxes for women. It is what we know. It is what we're trained to do. We cannot perform this on you for your safety as well as ours. Well, what did Jessica Yaniv do? As being part of the postmodern progressive crowd who demands radical tolerance and on the basis of nothing but utter subjectivity, she immediately filed a human rights complaint with the Canadian government. Now, being Canada, they didn't throw it out on the face of it. What they should have done was completely dismiss this. The women had a perfectly valid argument. They were not discriminating against him because he was transgender. They were discriminating against him because their services were only trained to provide that procedure to women. So the Canadians, being Canadians, rather than just dismissing it, they looked into this for a number of months, and they finally came back and they said, basically, you're delusional to Jessica Yaniv. They did the right thing. They exonerated the women who had been attacked by the transgender person and actually compelled Jessica Yaniv to pay a certain sum of money to those shops that he had slandered and which received a lot of hate mail because of his complaint. This is sort of where we are now. You will do what I tell you, even if it is utterly illogical to do so, even if there is no basis whatsoever on which to do it factually, materially. Well, Jessica Yaniv is in the news again today, this very day. She sent out a tweet yesterday in which she said she was referred to a gynecologist. And when I say she, I mean Jessica Yaniv, the man with male body parts who identifies as a female, actually got a referral from a doctor to go see a gynecologist. Let me repeat that. A man was just referred in Canada to a gynecologist. And to the surprise of almost nobody, when he showed up, Jessica Yaniv, at the gynecologist office, the gynecologist took one look at who he was dealing with and threw Jessica Yaniv out of his office and said, stop wasting my time. You are not a woman. You're a man. That is remarkable. And in Canada, that's remarkable. And one wonders, because now Jessica Yaniv is screaming bloody murder. She's screaming discrimination. She's investigating whether or not she will sue the doctor for not providing gynecological services. Now, this is where it gets tricky in Canada, which has gone farther down the progressive subjective rabbit hole than even we have in the United States. It's one thing for a spa to deny this. But and Canada certainly does, recognizes the Canadians. The Canadian government recognizes Jessica Yaniv as a woman because that's what he says she is. Then, by rights, does the gynecologist have the right not to give her an examination, not to give Yaniv the examination? And exactly, my friends, how would that work? It's like going to your local doctor as a woman and demanding a prostate exam. What has to happen there? I mean, the biological absurdity of where we are in Western culture is an existential threat, not just to freedom of speech, but freedom of association. 1,000 other God-given, naturally, constitutionally guaranteed rights and privileges are being threatened by this radical subjectivity. There was a boy in Parenting magazine, 4-year-old boy, too young to know any better, whose parents gave him a sign, put a sign in front of him, used the child as a kind of LGBT human shield, right? Cute little 4-year-old boy sitting there minding his own business, but he was holding a sign that said, some men have periods too. That was the sign. Some men have periods too. And I got to thinking about that sign. And the sign deconstructs itself. Because clearly mom and dad are exploiting this little boy for their own LGBT bona fides. Right? So the little 4-year-old's holding a placard that says, some men have periods. But if it's only some men who have periods, then it's no men who have periods. My point is that if they're correct, the progressive left, that you are what you say you are, then every man should be menstruating. But they're not. And so the sign itself undercut the message of the sign, showed how utterly subjective and stupid it was. And in the process of putting forth this self-contradictory, utterly subjective message, the parents of this little boy exploited him as a human shield for nonsense and subjectivity. It's a remarkable world we live in right now. Unless more of us stop laughing at these people and start confronting them with the absurdity of their behavior and use science, logic, history, and common sense to refute their delusions, we're going to lose a lot more than the battle of who gets to see who. I'm Dr. Duke with The New American.